Can a single gunshot change the fate of an entire continent? In the summer of 1914 in Sarajevo, one sound, one moment dragged millions into history's darkest war. But that bullet didn't fall into silence. It landed on decades of rivalry, fear, and rising tensions. This episode reveals how the spark was prepared.
That bullet had actually been waiting for years. Across the continent, power struggles, nationalism, rivalry, and fear had been piling up. On the surface, Europe looked wealthy, modern, and strong, but underneath, it was growing fragile and ready to explode.
Europe's leaders had built a giant chessboard of alliances and secret treaties. Every move unsettled another power, and the tension grew year by year. No one wanted a great war, but everyone was prepared for one.
And so, the summer of 1914 arrived. No one realized it, but Europe had already become a massive powder keg. The spark in Sarajevo didn't create the explosion. It simply lit what was already waiting.
At the start of the 20th century, Europe entered one of the fastest periods of change in its history. Every year, trains were faster, factories were larger, and cities were more crowded. Newspapers spoke of a modern world being born, yet few realized that this growth was also feeding a growing danger.
As industrial wealth grew, nationalism rose everywhere. Each nation saw itself as stronger, more independent, and more deserving than the rest. Crowds marched through the streets demanding a new Europe, but this new Europe would be built on rivalry, not peace.
In this climate, Europe slowly split into two major camps. On one side stood Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances appeared to exist for peace, but in reality, they formed a chain reaction waiting to ignite the entire continent.
These alliances did not bring safety. Instead, they triggered an arms race. Nations expanded their armies, modernized their navies, and developed new weapons. Each country believed it was defending itself, but from the outside, it looked like all of Europe was preparing for war. In this environment, European leaders reacted to even the smallest crises with fear. Diplomatic tables were no longer places of peace, but centers of mistrust. Every meeting, every treaty created new suspicions, and the atmosphere grew tighter with each passing month.
By the early 1910s, Europe was like a pot at full boil. Nationalism, economic rivalry, colonial competition, and alliance pressure all converged into one point. Europe was ready to explode. All it needed was a small spark.
The unification of Germany in 1871 changed Europe's balance entirely. This new nation was growing fast, powerful, ambitious, and unpredictable. For years, Bismarck's diplomatic brilliance kept the continent stable, but the fragile balance he built would soon give way to rivalry and distrust.
The new Germany was becoming an economic giant. Steel, coal, railways, all expanding at an astonishing pace. Germany's rise deeply worried France and Britain, because Europe's youngest power was now its fastest growing.
When Kaiser Wilhelm took the throne in 1888, Europe's future began to shift again. He was young, ambitious, and impatient. First, he dismissed Bismarck. Then, he decided Germany should take a much more aggressive role on the world stage.
Wilhelm's Germany wanted more power, not just in Europe, but across the world. Colonies, sea routes, and trade networks, these were the prizes of the great powers. This race pushed Germany into a dangerous collision course with Britain and France.
Germany's decision to build a massive navy caused panic in Britain. The nation that had ruled the seas for centuries would never accept such a challenge, and so a dangerous naval arms race began between the two powers.
This rivalry wasn't just military, it was psychological. Every new ship, every new factory became a symbol of threat to the other side. Europe had turned into a continent ruled by fear.
In the early years of the 20th century, Europe's balance collapsed completely. Distrust, nationalism, and rivalry had grown too deep to reverse. From this point on, war was only a matter of time, and the spark was no longer far away.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire looked strong from the outside, but inside, its multi-ethnic structure was cracking. Hungarians, Czechs, Serbs, Croats, each wanted more rights, while the central authority grew weaker every year. This giant empire was slowly sliding into an internal collapse.
The Ottoman Empire was exhausted after centuries of territorial losses. The Balkan Wars delivered a heavy blow. The economy was strained, and the army struggled to reorganize. The state wanted to modernize, but internal problems stood in the way.
Russia was a vast empire, but boiling from within. Growing dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime, strikes, economic crisis, and poverty had pushed society to its limits. This nation was about to enter not only a war, but a revolution.
Western Europe's great powers, Britain and France, appeared strong from the outside, but internal pressures were rising. Economic stagnation, colonial troubles, workers' movements. Trust between the public and governments was fading, and unrest was growing. All major European powers shared the same problem: weakening economies and rising social unrest. Unemployment, high prices, strikes, and increased taxes shattered the public's trust in the future. In such an atmosphere, even a small crisis could trigger enormous consequences. As rivalry grew between nations, anger accumulated among the people. Every group felt neglected, and everyone blamed someone else. In such an atmosphere, peace was no longer a realistic option. By 1914, all major European empires were coming apart piece by piece. Internal pressures grew, nations pulled away, and governments were losing control. The continent stood on the edge of a massive storm, and the event that would unleash it was about to take place in the Balkans.
In the early 20th century, the Balkans were the most complex region in Europe. Different nations, different religions, and centuries of rivalry had turned it into a room filled with gunpowder. A single spark here could set the entire continent on fire.
After gaining independence from the Ottoman Empire, Serbia witnessed a rapidly growing wave of nationalism. Its goal was clear: to unite all Serbs living across the Balkans. This ideology posed a serious threat to Austria-Hungary.
Bosnia and Herzegovina, annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, was a mosaic of nations. Bosniaks, Serbs, Croats, all living in the same streets. But this diversity was also a source of deep tension. Serbia's growth and rising nationalism alarmed Austria-Hungary. Verbal clashes, diplomatic crises, and threats grew between the two nations. Everyone knew this tension would eventually explode.
In this atmosphere, young revolutionary groups emerged. One of them was Young Bosnia. Radical youths seeking independence were ready for armed struggle against Austria, and this movement was preparing for an assassination that would change history. According to some historians, the Serbian Secret Service covertly supported planned attacks against Austria-Hungary. This link was never fully proven, but the atmosphere of the time made it highly plausible.
The Balkan crises were now the focus of all Europe. Newspapers warned that any war in the region would drag the great powers into conflict. The continent held its breath, waiting for an explosion. Daily life in Sarajevo appeared normal, yet beneath the surface, people sensed something was approaching. Soldiers were appearing more often in the streets, and police checks increased noticeably. During this period, a young Bosnian named Gavrilo Princip emerged as a revolutionary driven by radical beliefs. Raised in poverty and fueled by ideals of freedom, his name would soon be known by the entire world.
As Archduke Franz Ferdinand's visit to Sarajevo approached, Princip and his companions began to move. To them, this visit was an opportunity, and that opportunity would change the course of world history.
In the early 20th century, the Balkans were the most complex region in Europe. Different nations, different religions, and centuries of rivalry had turned it into a room filled with gunpowder. A single spark here could set the entire continent on fire.
At the start of the 20th century, the great powers were competing not only in Europe, but across the entire world. Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Maps were constantly redrawn, territories fought over. This competition had become a global source of tension. Africa was the fiercest arena of European competition. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, all raced for the continent's resources. This process became a struggle that shook both Africa and European politics. One of Germany's greatest fears was entering the colonial race too late. While Britain and France held vast empires, Germany had gained very little. This created frustration and anxiety in Berlin.
Britain was the unquestioned ruler of the seas. Its navy was essential for protecting global trade, so Germany's construction of a massive fleet was seen as a direct threat in London.
In 1906, Britain built a massive warship called the Dreadnought, instantly making every other navy outdated. The ship was so powerful that other nations had no choice but to imitate it. The race had reached a deadly new level. Germany's response came from beneath the waves, the U-boats. Silent, invisible, and deadly. These submarines showed the world what future wars would look like.
U-boat attacks began threatening Britain's trade routes. Every ship sunk brought the two nations closer to war. The seas had become minefields of tension.
Colonial competition created new crises not only in Africa, but across the world. In Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific, every dispute increased the tension between the great powers. By 1914, both the colonial race and the arms race had spiraled out of control. No nation could back down anymore, and no leader could say, "Stop." The world was drifting toward a great war, ready to fall.
In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand planned an official visit to Bosnia. His aim was to strengthen loyalty in this critical region of the empire. But this visit would soon become one of the greatest tragedies in history.
Despite all warnings, the security arrangements for the visit were extremely weak. The route was publicly printed in newspapers. For an assassination attempt, the opportunity could not have been better.
The Young Bosnia movement had been preparing for days. Weapons were smuggled into the city, and each member positioned themselves. They all waited for one single target, the Archduke's car.
The atmosphere in Sarajevo was tense. Life appeared normal, yet there was an unusual unease in people's faces. The city felt that something catastrophic was coming.
European newspapers highlighted the significance of this visit. Some saw it as a political message, others as a display of power. But no one imagined it would mark the beginning of a world war.
Some intelligence reports warned of a possible attack, but Austrian officials dismissed these warnings. Once again, history would be shaped by the small details everyone ignored.
On the evening of June 27th, the city looked calm. But beneath the surface, something was boiling. The assassins made their final preparations, while Europe believed it was just another ordinary day. The storm was now only hours away.
On the morning of June 28, 1914, Sarajevo began its day quietly. A light mist hung over the streets as people slowly filled the city. No one knew that within minutes, the course of history would change.
As the Archduke's motorcade entered the city center, the first attack took place. An assassin threw a bomb, but it bounced off the car and exploded behind it. Franz Ferdinand escaped unharmed, but this was only the beginning.
After the attack, the route was changed, but the driver was not informed in time. The car turned onto the wrong street, the very street where Gavrilo Princip was standing.
Gavrilo Princip recognized the moment. He stepped forward from the crowd, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. In that instant, the fate of Europe changed. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were fatally wounded. Within minutes, they died in the car. The city fell into silence. But that silence was only the warning of the storm to come. Those 2 bullets cast a dark shadow over an entire continent.